Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rose and Rubini podcast. As always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. And this week, we're speaking about the war in Ukraine when rhetoric is weaponized. Brunello, we've seen over the last few weeks, as the war rages on, there's a parallel effort, a diplomatic effort, where countries from the West are trying to engage with Russia, trying to see what its objectives are, where it can see concessions, and ultimately bring about a diplomatic end to the war. But increasingly, that sort of diplomatic solution seems precarious. Could you give us a bit more context around that?
Sure. As we know, there are kind of two separate streams in this war, if you want. One is the military stream, and the other one is the diplomatic channel. On the military side, as we have discussed many times, the Russians have effectively implemented a three-pronged approach, attacking from the southwest of Odessa, the southeast of Mariupol, and then from the north to try to get to Kiev. Now, it seems like the first and the third of these two attempts are not going as well as the Russians thought. In particular, the siege of Kiev has not really started, or if it has started, is not working to the point that the Russians are saying that they are partly withdrawing some troops from Kiev. On the other side, the US and its allies are saying, don't trust these moves, it may just be tactical, just to
Mhm.
lower your defense. War goes on, and anything can still happen. While this kind of battle continues on the military side, of course, there are diplomatic channels open to try to solve the situation. The latest round was held in Turkey. Maybe some progress seems to be made on that side, but the reality is that it's very hard to reach an agreement until the two sides can properly see an end game. And then, and this is effectively this week's discussion, when the two sides don't recognize each other as trustworthy counterpart, or a counterparty that you can really deal with.
Right. I know you're a big advocate as well of using history as a lens to analyze some of these situations. I'm wondering if you feel there's an appropriate sort of historical analogy that might, when applied to this, help us better understand what's happening on the ground.
Sure. So what has happened in this case is that President Biden called President Putin a war criminal. In a slightly unexpected way, he was asked that question. He immediately said no, but then he returned a couple of minutes later to say, what was your question? Yes, of course, he's a war criminal. So clearly he thought about it. So somebody advised him in that respect, and he came back. And then when he was in Warsaw, he gave a speech, and in an unscripted moment, he said that for God's sake, this guy can't remain in power. So all these kind of phrases just put, if you want, throw fuel on fire, because effectively you are delegitimizing your counterparty as a person you can deal with. And the historical reference I have in mind is what happened with Adolf Hitler in the 20th century. There was kind of an Adolf Hitler that could be seen, that Western leaders could be seen with, and that was prior to the Munich 1938 conference. And then there was Adolf Hitler that nobody would ever want to be seen with, or let alone sign peace agreements or any kind of treaty with this person. And you see the pictures in Munich 1938. There's Hitler, there's Mussolini, there's Chamberlain, there's Devadier. So his opponents were still willing to deal with Hitler, even if it was clear what his intentions were. In fact, they allowed him to occupy the Sudeten. But when he then decided to occupy the entire Czechoslovakia, and then even more so Poland in 1940, 39, then clearly it became a sort of pariah, somebody that couldn't be dealt with apart from militarily. So effectively, I think with these words, we might have overcome that threshold. And yes, the US State Secretary said, oh no, we are not looking for a regime change. We are not looking to substitute Putin. But who really wants to sign a deal with somebody that is being considered a war criminal, with somebody that you say can't remain in power? So, is kind of the risk is that instead of making a potential peace agreement more likely in the short term, you're actually making less likely in the short term.
Right. I mean, I think it's also might be useful sort of just to put forward the counter argument here, because some might look at that and say, when Biden was asked point blank by a reporter whether or not Putin's a war criminal, it creates this weird situation for him that he almost necessarily has to say yes and has to actually call out the ground reality, because that's the only way to embolden Ukrainian resistance. And to some degree, that's a core aspect of America's foreign policy there. And so, I mean, I'd sort of ask you, what do you think ideally Biden should have done? In what way could he have managed both alternative sort of considerations? Could he have, is there possible to that he would have emboldened Ukrainian resistance, but at the same time created a situation where he still has the opportunity for negotiating with Putin in the future?
You're kind of right. I mean, you have a valid point. When you are confronted with those kind of questions, damn if you do, damn if you don't. I mean, whatever you said would be interpreted badly, misinterpreted, interpreted in the wrong way. So somehow I understand that President Biden was put in a difficult spot. In Warsaw, instead, he had clearly the intention, or maybe it was a slip of his mind, but still, he was less prompted. It was not put on the spot. It was his own kind of making, decided to say that this guy can't stay in power, as if he knows that we will not remain in power, or is doing something about it, perhaps fostering some form of opposition within Russia, although in thinking about the regime change in Russia is extremely hard at this stage. Only the military effectively could engineer a regime change at this stage in Russia. So it's very complicated. So it's, also the other side need to show that even in this very heated situation, you need to remain with a cold mind and say the right things at the right time. What can be done to embolden the Ukrainian resistance without totally antagonizing Russia? Of course, it's hard to say. My suggestion is making sure that you show to the Ukrainians with acts, not just words, that you're there to help them, that whatever happens, that as people say, we got their back. So effectively, somehow there will be a tomorrow, even if this war ends somehow badly for them or not as desirable for them, because clearly everybody will need to save face, including Putin at this stage. And you need to find a safe facing agreement by which Putin can say, okay, I told you, you shouldn't do that. Now, okay, I went through that and now I achieved the goal that I wanted, and I can now somehow withdraw or establish a new status quo, freeze the situation as it is, and this being recognized by international community. Clearly, the problem on the ground remains that after you have created so much suffering, so many deaths, including in the civilian population, it will always be very hard to consider Putin the same way he was considered prior to the war, where he had done things that were borderline or even beyond the borderline, including, of course, the annexation of Crimea. But at the same time, somehow he was forgiven. This may be a step too far to forgive him for the international community, and that's why it's a bit of a conundrum on how to solve these intricate situation diplomatically. But that's why you have an entire armies, not just of soldiers, but of diplomatic people that effectively need to find a solution. You know, just to remember the end of World War II, the Americans did bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki in clearly what was considered to be, you know, one of the greatest military operation in history, one of the most significantly, however you want to look at it, and yet they managed to sign a peace agreement with Emperor Hirohito that remained in power for a few more years after the end of World War II. Perhaps that could be the template that can be used, or maybe not. People are there working hard to try to find a diplomatic solution to this kind of very complicated situation.
Right. I mean, it reminds me of, I mean, the US has had sort of for decades a certain playbook on, you know, the China-Taiwan crisis. And
Yeah.
it's kind of maintained this fog of strategic ambiguity when it looks at Taiwan. It wants to support Taiwan in military, economic, political means, but without explicitly going on and antagonizing, you know, China. And then sort of explicitly recognizing its statehood, even though de facto everyone knows what sort of the ground reality is. And perhaps, you know, even though the US has had decades to maintain that position, what would be ideal is if Biden could, in, you know, a matter of weeks, have something, you know, akin to that in the situation with Ukraine and Russia.
Potentially that could be another example of template.
Yeah, no, certainly very, very interesting times to come. And we do hope for the best. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.